So we talked about organs, and now we're going to take one step down the hierarchy of organization to talk about tissues, right? So organs are made up of different tissues. So plants have three different types of tissues. They have dermal, vascular, and ground. Dermal tissue is kind of like the covering. So dermal tissue is typically going to be covering the entire outside of the plant. So if you look in this picture over here, the dermal tissue is blue. So you can see that every single organ is made up of all three of these tissues, right? So we've got the roots, the stems, and the leaves, and they're all made up of all three. And you can see that the outside of the plant, and you can see these sections, the outside of the plant is all blue because it's covered in the dermis. Vascular tissue is how they transport water and products from photosynthesis. So in the picture, the vascular tissue is all purple. And it goes into every single tissue, but it looks a little different. So vascular tissue is arranged in veins in this leaf, in small sections in the stems, and then it's usually like right here in the center in the roots. And then in between that, we have ground tissue. So in this picture, that's yellow. Oh, that's a no. So pretty much the vascular tissue is usually in the center of the plant. Anything in between the vascular and the outside of the plant is called ground tissue. Ground tissue is kind of everything else. Ground tissue is usually the most metabolically active. Those are the tissues that are going to do storage, some transport, photosynthesis, all sorts of functions in the ground tissue. So let's take them one by one. Let's start from the outside. So dermal tissue in a non-woody plant is the outside. It consists of the epidermis, which is a layer of cells on the outside of the plant. And then usually outside of the epidermis, there is a waxy coating called a cuticle. So if you go touch a leaf, it might feel kind of waxy, and that's that cuticle coating. The cuticle is to help prevent water loss. Some specialized cells appear in some of the different organs. So in the roots, the epidermis is this outermost layer here, right? So this is the outside. And the root hairs are projections from this epidermis cell. And these increase the surface area for absorption of water. So a huge amount of water actually gets absorbed from these root hairs, which are epidermal tissue. In shoots, so stems and leaves, we often see things like trichomes, and those can take different shapes. This one's a little spiky. There's more trichomes down here. This prefix trick means hair. And so a lot of the times they look a little bit like hairs. They're not actually hairs. But if you go look at it like the stems of a plant and it looks really fuzzy on the outside, that's probably the trichomes. And they function for different reasons. Sometimes they help to reduce water loss. Sometimes they reflect light to help protect the photosynthetic pigments. They can be spiky and pointed and defend against insects. They can have toxic compounds in them to, again, help defend against like herbivores. Another specialized cell in the epidermis, so these are found on leaves. So this is a leaf, and we have the guard cell. So you can see the stomata is the opening here, and these two cells right there are the guard cells. And those are going to open and close the stomata to help regulate gas exchange into and out of the leaf. Because the cuticle, when it stops water, also stops gas from getting through. So we need these guard cells to kind of open up to allow gas to move into and out of the leaf. Let's go all the way to the inside of the plant now. We have vascular tissue. Vascular tissue can be broken up into two main systems. We have xylem, and xylem, I remember, moves water up. You can help you to remember this because X and W are both at the end of the alphabet. Typically, this is going to take the things that we absorb in the roots, like water and minerals, and move them up to the areas in the plant where it's going to do photosynthesis. And then phloem moves food down. I remember phloem, food, right? Plants make food during photosynthesis, so they're going to transport things like sugars or other structures from where they're made, which is usually leaves, which is where we're doing photosynthesis. And it's usually bringing them down either to the roots for storage or to other apical buds where the plant is going to continue to grow. In a stem, so this is a stem, this is a monocot stem, you can see that each one of these is a little vascular bundle. And we've got the phloem out here and the xylem in here. This is the center in there, and then this would be the epidermis out here. So you're only seeing part of the stem. And then this down here is a monocot root. And it's got this structure in the center called a stele, where it's got all of the vascular tissue is right here in the center. So in the stem, they tend to be spread out, and the roots, they tend to be in the center. Again, you're going to see phloem on the outside, xylem on the inside, and they're all kind of clumped here together in the center. And the arrangement looks different in monocots versus dicots. And then the last type of tissue is the ground tissue. And this is pretty much everything else. So if it's not an outer covering and it's not a vascular tissue, then it belongs to the ground tissue system. So this would be a typical stem here. Inside of the vascular bundles, we have ground tissue, and it's typically called pith when it's in the very center. When it's outside, so in this area where we're kind of between the vascular and the dermal, we typically call this the cortex, but both pith and cortex are ground tissue. So these can be made for support, these can be made for storage, these can do photosynthesis. So we have a lot of ground tissue in the leaves called mesophyll that does photosynthesis. Some of these can also do transport, but xylem is the main, xylem and phloem, the vascular systems are the main transport system. But overall, the ground tissue is the most metabolic active tissue.